So think about this for a second. If you change like one single word in a centuries-old family recipe, you basically ruin the cake.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, like you substitute salt for sugar because of, I don't know, a smudged letter on the paper, and the physical reality of what comes out of the oven is just completely unrecognizable.
Yeah, it's a totally different thing at that point.
Exactly. But what happens when a king forces a translation change in the most printed book in human history? I mean, you don't just change a document, you fundamentally re-engineer the physical behavior, the community structure, and like the weekly habits of billions of people.
You really do. It completely rewrites reality, and that's what we're getting into today. The premise we are looking at argues that the entire modern structure of what we call Christianity, so the buildings, the institutional hierarchies, the global networks, all of that rests largely on the translation of one specific ancient Greek noun.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. I am super excited for this one.
In here, it's a fascinating topic.
So, we are examining a highly analytical essay, and it's titled Everything Proceeds from Doctrine. It was published by an organization called Dare to Think, and this essay leans heavily on a historical and linguistic thesis written back in 1951.
Right, by Roger Williams Maslin at Baylor University.
Yes, exactly, Maslin. And the central argument they make is just staggering. They argue that the modern concept of the church, capital C, the massive universal institution, is actually based on a profound linguistic misunderstanding of the Greek word ecclesia.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how the author builds a framework to show this. They show how deeply tradition shapes the way we read original texts.
Right.
And then how the way we read those texts shapes our core beliefs, their doctrine, and
Yeah.
ultimately how that doctrine dictates real-world practice.
So it all trickles down.
Exactly. The core argument is that you cannot act correctly unless you believe correctly. If your foundational definition of a core concept is off by even like a few degrees, the trajectory of your practice is going to end up on an entirely different continent over the span of 2 millennia.
Man, that is okay. I want to look at the psychological mechanism behind that first, because before the author even touches the Greek language, they establish this really fascinating contrast between two different ways human beings process information.
Yeah, the progressions.
Right. So they call the first one the biblical progression, and it's highly linear. You have a text. That text demands an interpretation. That interpretation forms your doctrine, and that doctrine dictates your practice.
Yeah.
So text, interpretation, doctrine, practice.
Which is, it is the ideal progression, right?
Right.
It is how we assume our legal systems, our contracts, and obviously our religious texts function.
In a perfect world, sure.
Exactly. But the essay argues that human nature rarely actually sustains that linear progression over multiple generations. Once a practice has existed for a few centuries, an alternative, far more dangerous progression takes over.
And this is where it gets messy.
Very messy. It starts with tradition. That tradition creates an assumed meaning. That assumed meaning is then used to interpret the original scripture, and then that interpretation is deployed to justify the continued practice.
Okay, let's unpack this because I'm getting stuck here for a second. The way you're framing this second progression makes it sound almost malicious.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like, wait, isn't tradition just the accumulated wisdom of the past? We rely on tradition for society to function. Inherited practices are usually just, things that worked for our ancestors. Is the author genuinely treating tradition itself as an inherent threat to understanding a text?
No, and that's a great clarification. The text is very careful to draw a line here. The author isn't claiming that tradition is inherently evil or born out of malice. Not at all.
Okay, good, because that would be a tough sell.
Right. Traditions usually begin for highly practical, logistical, or even really beautiful reasons. The danger isn't that traditions exist. The danger is when tradition becomes the actual lens through which you define the literal vocabulary of an ancient document.
So meaning you stop reading the dictionary and you start reading your own modern habits back into the words.
Precisely. You cannot allow centuries of subsequent theological and institutional development to be silently slipped into the lexical definition of a first-century Greek word.
Because then you're just validating yourself.
Exactly. When you do that, your reasoning becomes a closed circular loop. People walking through this second progression genuinely believe they are being faithful to the original text. They open their books, they read the words, and they feel they are aligning with the original authors.
But they're not.
Right. because they're wearing tradition-tinted glasses. They are defining the ancient vocabulary based entirely on what they already do in their modern lives.
You know, we see this psychological loop outside of religion all the time. Like, think about constitutional law.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. You have these incredibly brief, centuries old amendments, and modern society is constantly fighting over whether we are reading our current technological habits, like digital privacy or modern firearms, back into the minds of the founders.
Yeah, we totally project our reality backward.
Exactly. Or even look at a smaller scale, like a corporate policy. A company implements a weird temporary fix for a software bug, right? 10 years go by, the original developers are gone, new employees come in, and they just assume this weird habit is an official rule.
And they defend it like it's sacred.
Yes. Suddenly, everyone is bending over backward to interpret the employee handbook to justify this convoluted process that was never even meant to be permanent. We inherit a practice, we assume it is the law, and we basically reverse engineer the rulebook to protect the practice.
That is exactly it. And the essay argues that the ultimate, most globally impactful test case for this exact psychological loop involves the word church.
Which brings us to the Greek.
Yes. To understand the scale of the argument, we have to look at the linguistic environment of the first century. The word in question is the Greek noun ecclesia.
Okay, let's ground this for the listener real quick. What kind of Greek are we actually talking about here? Because I think there is this massive assumption that the Bible was written in some sort of elevated, sacred, magical dialect. You know, like it operated on a higher plane than normal human speech.
That is a crucial misconception to clear up,
Yeah.
actually, and Maslin's thesis addresses it head on. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek,
Coin.
right? And Koine literally means common. It wasn't the elevated poetic language of classical philosophers, and it certainly wasn't an isolated sacred dialect invented for religious purposes.
So it's just everyday street language.
Exactly. It was the language of the marketplace, the soldiers, the merchants, the everyday civic life of the Roman Empire. And in that ordinary everyday language, the established lexical sense of the word ecclesia was simply an assembly, a gathering, or a congregation.
Okay, but I've heard a different definition, though.
Let me guess, they called out ones.
Yes. I've heard people take the word ecclesia, chop it into its two Greek roots, ek, meaning out of, and koleo, meaning to call, and define it as the called out ones. It paints this picture of a special spiritual group of people separated from the world.
Right, it sounds very poetic.
Yeah, and the author calls this the false etymology trap. But why is that a trap? I mean, it sounds completely logical to look at the roots of a word to figure out what it means.
It sounds profound, sure, but it is a massive linguistic fallacy. Maslin draws heavily on the work of F.J.A. Hort, who is a massive figure in biblical scholarship, to reject this approach.
Okay, so what's Hort's argument?
The problem with etymology is that it tells you where a word originated historically, perhaps centuries before it was written down, but it tells you absolutely nothing about what the word actually meant to the people speaking it in the moment. Usage dictates meaning, not component parts.
Oh, I see. It's like the butterfly problem.
The butterfly problem, I like that.
Yeah, like if an archaeologist from the year 4000 unearths the English word butterfly and relies strictly on etymology, they break it into butter and fly, and they're going to conclude that 21st century people were terrorized by airborne dairy products.
That is a perfect illustration. Seriously, that nails it. Or think of the word pineapple.
Right. No pines, no apples.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with pine trees or apples. You have to look at how the word was deployed in everyday conversation.
Yep.
And the essay provides this amazing piece of evidence from the New Testament itself that completely shatters the idea that ecclesia carried some inherent, sacred, called out theological meaning.
Where is that?
It takes us to the book of Acts, chapter 19.
Oh, the riot in Ephesus. This scene in Acts 19 is fascinating. Set the scene for me because I love this story. What is happening in this specific city, and why does the author point to it as a definitive proof of what ecclesia means?
Okay, so the setting is the city of Ephesus. It's a major commercial and religious hub in the ancient world, completely famous for its massive temple to the goddess Artemis.
Big tourist destination.
Huge! And the Apostle Paul has been preaching there. His message that gods made with human hands are not gods at all is starting to seriously hurt the local economy.
Because they sell the idols.
Specifically, yeah, it's hurting the silversmiths who make their fortune selling little silver shrines of Artemis.
So it's not even really a religious crisis, it's an economic crisis masquerading as a religious one.
Exactly. So a silversmith named Demetrius gets his fellow tradesmen together,
Right.
whips them into a total frenzy about losing their income and their goddess, and they start a citywide riot.
Just a full-on mob?
Yes, they drag two of Paul's traveling companions into the massive open-air theater. The scene is pure, unadulterated chaos. The text literally says some were shouting one thing, some were shouting another, and most of them didn't even know why they were there.
Right, a completely secular, out-of-control, pagan mob.
Yes. And eventually, a city official, the town clerk, manages to quiet the crowd. He tells them that if the silversmiths have a legitimate legal grievance, the courts are open. But if they want to settle this broader issue, it must be determined in a lawful ecclesia.
Wait, he uses the word there.
He does. And then after he says this, the text says he dismissed the ecclesia.
He dismissed the mob. And the author of the book of Acts uses the exact same word, ecclesia, to describe this rioting, pagan, confused crowd of silversmiths that is used everywhere else to describe the Christian gatherings.
That is the pivotal insight. There is absolutely nothing Christian or sacred or spiritually called out about that gathering in the Ephesian theater. It is a secular mob. Yet the biblical text labels it an ecclesia.
Why? Just because they were together.
Because the people had physically assembled in one place. That is the baseline, irreducible dictionary definition of the word. Now, obviously, when first century Christians used the word, their specific assembly took on a Christian identity, a specific purpose, and an order based on their relationship to Christ.
Right. But the author's point is that adding Christian characteristics to a gathering doesn't magically rewrite the dictionary definition of the noun itself.
Correct. Maslin implements a crucial methodological safeguard here. He says theological characteristics cannot erase lexical definitions.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if I invite you to a dinner, and we happen to discuss high-level philosophy while we eat, that makes it a philosophical dinner.
Yeah, sounds like a fun night.
But it does not change the dictionary definition of the word dinner to mean an invisible, universal matrix of intellectual thought.
Right.
It's still just a physical meal. The Ephesian mob was an ecclesia because they assembled. The Christians in Corinth were ecclesia because they assembled.
Okay, hold on. This is where I get tripped up. If the Greek word universally meant a literal, physical assembly of people, how did we get the English word church?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because when I hear church, I don't just think of a group of people standing in a room. I think of real estate. I think of denominational headquarters, bureaucratic structures, global hierarchies, tax-exempt statuses. Church carries a mountain of institutional baggage that assembly doesn't have. Where does the word actually come from?
The linguistic shift here is one of the most consequential in history.
Yeah.
Maslin points out that the English word church has absolutely zero linguistic DNA tying it to the Greek word ecclesia.
Zero.
None. It does not descend from it at all. It comes from an entirely different Greek word, kyriakon.
Wait, so the English translators looked at the word ecclesia, completely ignored its lineage, and just pulled from a different root entirely. How does kyriakon even translate?
Kyriakon is an adjective. It simply means belonging to the Lord or pertaining to the Lord.
Okay.
Over centuries of historical usage, long after the first century, this adjective became closely associated with the physical building where Christians met the Lord's house. Through various linguistic evolutions as the language moved through Germanic tongues into Old English, kyriakon morphed into kirk and eventually church.
Wow.
So the word church inherently carries the semantic history of a physical structure or an institutional possession, not the action of people assembling.
But languages evolve naturally all the time, right? Is the essay suggesting this was just a sloppy accident of language over time, or was there an active choice to suppress the actual meaning of ecclesia?
The author presents historical evidence showing it was not merely an accident, it actually became a deliberate, enforced mandate. And the essay centers this on the translation of the English Bible, specifically looking at the friction between early translators like William Tyndale and the later King James Version.
Oh, let's talk about Tyndale, because he is a massive figure in the history of the English language. What did he do with the word ecclesia?
So Tyndale, working in the early 1500s, was deeply committed to returning to the original Greek rather than relying on the Latin Vulgate. When he encountered ecclesia, he looked at its usage, recognized it meant a physical gathering, and accurately translated it into English as congregation.
He used congregation, which makes perfect sense because a congregation is a tangible group of people who congregate.
Exactly.
But that choice got him into a massive amount of trouble, didn't it?
It was incredibly subversive for the time. By translating it as congregation, Tyndale stripped away the institutional authority that the religious hierarchy had built around the concept of the church.
Oh, I see.
He was saying, linguistically, that the power and the presence of God rested with a local physical gathering of believers, not with a vast, distant bureaucratic structure headed by monarchs and prelates. Tyndale was eventually burned at the stake, and his translation choices were a significant part of the theological strife he posed.
Which brings us to 1604 and King James. Because I think most people assume the King James Version of the Bible was just, a group of scholars trying to make the most accurate translation possible.
That's the common assumption, yeah.
But the essay points out there was an intense political motive behind how they handled this specific word. Why was King James so afraid of Tyndale's word, congregation?
We have to understand the political climate of King James's England. James believed absolutely in the divine right of kings. He sat at the top of both the state and the religious hierarchy.
Right, he's the head of everything.
But he was facing a growing movement of Puritans who favored a more localized, congregational form of governance. They used translations like the Geneva Bible, which retained Tyndale's use of congregation, and actually included margin notes that often questioned royal and hierarchical authority.
So the very word congregation was a threat to the monarchy's power structure. Like, if the text says the authority lies in the local assembly, the king completely loses his grip on the religious lives of the people.
Exactly. King James needed a translation that reinforced the institutional hierarchy. So when he commissioned his new version, he issued a highly specific set of translation rules.
Rules for the translators.
Yes. Rule number 3 explicitly commanded the translators to retain the old ecclesiastical words. The mandate specifically dictated that the word church must not be translated as congregation.
That is the aha moment right there. They legally forced the translators to use a word rooted in institutional real estate kyriakon, or church, instead of the word that actually matched the Greek action of gathering ecclesia, congregation.
The essay argues that this mandate fundamentally altered the English reader's perception of reality. By substituting a loaded institutional term for a simple relational noun, a massive theological conclusion was silently baked into the translation.
It's the difference between referring to the players on a field as a team versus calling them a franchise.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Think about it. If I read a historical document about a team, I picture an active relationship. I picture people sweating, coordinating, and interacting locally.
Right.
But if someone systematically alters that document to replace every instance of team with franchise, it completely changes my psychological relationship to the text. A franchise is a legal corporate structure. It involves owners, legal departments, branding.
The vibe is totally different.
Completely. The players are no longer the focus, they're just cogs in an overarching, invisible entity. The translation mandates swap the team for a franchise.
That analogy perfectly captures the psychological displacement the author is highlighting. When a modern reader opens their text and sees the word church, all of those later institutional associations flood into the passage before the original Greek concept of a simple local assembly is even considered.
I mean, I can accept the history. The Tyndale versus King James dynamic is a historical fact, but this raises a massive theological dilemma for me.
What's the dilemma?
If ecclesia strictly means a local, literal assembly of people in one room, how does the author explain all the towering cosmic passages in the text that seem to clearly point to a worldwide, universal, invisible church?
The stakes of this question are incredibly high. The universal church theory is the bedrock of massive theological systems. Historically, if the church is universal and invisible, then whoever controls the earthly hierarchy of that church holds the keys to heaven.
Right.
Excommunication meant being cut off from the universal body of Christ. If, however, the church is strictly local, no single earthly institution holds global control.
So how does Maslin's thesis and the essay overall tackle those universal passages?
The author tackles it by introducing a fundamental concept of grammar called the generic singular. And the argument is that just because ecclesia is used in a broad or abstract sense in certain texts, it does not mean the underlying nature of the noun magically transforms into a worldwide mystical entity.
Okay, lay out the mechanics of the generic singular for me, because if Paul uses a singular word, my modern brain automatically pictures one giant object. It takes active mental effort to look at the singular phrase, the church, and translate that to a category of individual physical gatherings. Is the author saying the early readers just did that natively?
Yes, because we still do it natively today in everyday speech.
Mm-hmm.
A singular noun does not always denote one numerically singular gigantic object. It is frequently used to describe a class, a kind, or an institution. The essay uses biblical examples like the laborer is worthy of his hire or the fig tree.
Or like when Paul says in Ephesians, the husband is the head of the wife.
Perfect example.
No one reads that and imagines a colossal, mystical husband floating in the stratosphere, comprised of all the billions of individual husbands on earth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You instinctively understand that Paul is speaking generically about the institution of marriage or the class of husbands. What he says is characteristically true of the relationship, but it is manifested entirely in millions of individual physical marriages.
Let me apply this to a modern institutional equivalent to see if I have the mechanics right. Think about the American jury system.
Okay.
If a legal scholar writes a book and says the jury is the bedrock of the American justice system, the jury listens to the evidence and renders a verdict. The scholar is using a singular noun, the jury.
Right.
But they are not claiming there is one invisible, mystical national jury sitting in an ethereal courtroom in the sky made up of every citizen who has ever received a summons.
That is an excellent parallel.
The scholar is talking about the concept of the jury, but that concept only ever actually exists and only ever functions when 12 specific physical people assemble in one specific room to hear one specific case. You cannot present evidence to the national universal jury. You can only present it to a local assembly of 12 people.
And that is exactly Maslin's argument regarding ecclesia. He distinguishes between the concrete use of the word pointing to a specific local assembly in a town like Corinth and the abstract or generic use, where the assembly is considered as an institution.
But it's still an assembly.
That is the critical point. The underlying kind of thing being described does not change. A jury is still 12 people in a room, even when you speak of it generically. An ecclesia is still a local assembly of people, even when Christ speaks of it generically as his institution.
I want to run some scriptural stress tests on this, if you don't mind, because there are verses that seem incredibly difficult to fit into this local assembly definition. Let's start with the big one. Matthew 16:18. Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." That singular phrase, my church, is the cornerstone of the universal church theory.
Maslin argues that this statement is perfectly intelligible as a generic or institutional use. Christ is saying he will build his kind of assembly, his divinely established institution. And the essay provides a massive contextual control for this interpretation just 2 chapters later.
What happens 2 chapters later?
In Matthew 18.17, Jesus is giving practical instructions for handling a dispute between two individuals. And he says, if they won't listen to reason, tell it unto the church, or ecclesia.
The mechanics of that command are impossible if the church is universal.
Exactly. The ecclesia in Matthew 18 is capable of being spoken to. It can hear evidence. It can render a judgment and enact discipline. Those are the functions of an identifiable, literal, physically present assembly. You cannot tell it to a mystical, invisible, worldwide entity.
You literally can't do it.
Right. So the essay argues if Jesus uses the word to mean a literal assembly in chapter 18, why must we invent an entirely new, invisible definition for the exact same word in chapter 16?
The burden of proof lies on the person trying to invent the second dictionary definition.
Precisely. The author establishes a vital rule for critical interpretation. A new, massive theological meaning should not be assigned to a word if the ordinary established meaning still works perfectly fine to explain the passage. You don't create a second definition unless the first one fundamentally breaks down.
Okay, I can accept that discipline requires a physical group. But what about history? Look at Galatians 1.13. Paul writes that he persecuted the church of God. You can't persecute a generic concept. But you also can't persecute every single Christian on the planet. So what is he talking about?
Maslin points out that Paul's persecution, as recorded in the book of Acts, was historically centered upon the specific massive assembly in Jerusalem. He targeted that specific ecclesia and the members who scattered from it.
Oh, so it was a specific local group.
Yes. But even if Paul is speaking collectively of all the various local assemblies he targeted in different cities, the language does not require the invention of a worldwide organization. If I say I campaigned against the local school board, I am speaking collectively of an institution. I don't need to invent an invisible universal school board to make the sentence make sense.
Okay, let me push back even harder. Surely Paul's instructions about cosmic, universal truth imply something bigger than a local gathering. In 1 Timothy 3.15, Paul calls the church the pillar and ground of the truth. You can't fit universal cosmic truth inside one little room in the ancient Mediterranean. That has to be referring to the grand, overarching, universal body of believers.
The author asks us to look at the immediate context of that verse. 1 Timothy 3 is an intensely practical chapter. It outlines the behavioral qualifications for local overseers and deacons. It discusses household order, marriage, and how to conduct oneself.
Right.
Maslin points out that you can only order the behavior of an actual physical assembly. You cannot regulate the practical, day-to-day behavior of a mystical entity.
So, how can a small room of people be the pillar of truth?
Because while the truth they uphold is universally valid, it is only visibly confessed, protected, and embodied in the local assembly. A single embassy in a foreign country is the physical ground of that nation's sovereignty in that city.
That's a great analogy.
It holds a reality much larger than its physical footprint, but the embassy itself remains a specific, local building with specific, local people.
We have to tackle the most famous metaphor of all, though, the body of Christ. If anything proves the existence of a universal, mystical, invisible church, it is the concept that all Christians everywhere make up the body of Christ.
The essay devotes a significant amount of analysis to this, specifically focusing on 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4, where the ecclesia is explicitly identified as the body. And again, the author asks us to look closely at the mechanical function of the metaphor of the text rather than relying on later theological assumptions.
What do they find?
Well, in 1 Corinthians 12.27, Paul writes, "Now ye are the body of Christ."
He says ye, like plural you. He is addressing the specific people reading the letter in the physical city of Corinth.
Yes. The pronoun is directed at the specific local recipients. And look at how Paul describes the functions of this body throughout the chapter. He says the body has members that suffer together. When one part hurts, every part hurts.
Right, they rejoice together.
Yes, they honor the weaker members among them. Crucially, he warns them against experiencing schism and division within the body.
And you cannot experience a schism with someone you have never met, who lives on the other side of the planet in a different century. Schism requires proximity, it requires friction.
Exactly. Maslin highlights how the author reframes the body. The body is not a theoretical theological roster of all saved people throughout history, maintained in a heavenly filing cabinet. It is an operative, relational, physical entity.
It's active.
The essay points to Ephesians 4.1 scene, which describes the body being joined together, supplied by the physical functioning of its various parts, and edifying itself in love.
You know, the essay brings up the one another commands here, and for me, this was the moment the whole linguistic argument crystallized into human reality. The New Testament commands believers to love one another, receive one another, serve one another, bear one another's burdens, forgive one another, teach, comfort, and exhort one another.
And the analytical point the author is driving home is this: you cannot fulfill a single one of those reciprocal relational commands sitting by yourself, conceptualizing your membership in an invisible universal network.
You just can't.
Fulfilling the one another commands requires severe physical interaction. It requires proximity. It requires an actual assembled body of people who know each other's flaws, see each other's physical needs, and can bear each other's actual tangible burdens.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because rejecting the universal church theory feels like stepping off a theological cliff for a lot of people.
It definitely does.
If someone accepts this linguistic argument, if they agree that ecclesia only means a physical assembly, does that mean they are rejecting the spiritual connection of all Christians worldwide? Is the author saying that a believer in America and a believer in an underground gathering in China have zero connection? Because that seems like a massive, heartbreaking loss of unity.
It is a vital question, and the author anticipates it carefully. The essay explicitly states absolutely not. Rejecting the universal definition of the specific Greek noun ecclesia does not mean rejecting spiritual unity.
Oh, so they still believe in the unity.
Oh, absolutely. The text continually affirms that believers across the globe share one Lord, one faith, one Spirit, one hope, and a common relationship to God through Christ. Believers are part of the family of God. They are citizens of the kingdom. The spiritual unity of all believers is an absolute reality.
So what is the actual conflict then?
The conflict is entirely linguistic.
Yeah.
The issue is that we do not need to force the specific functional Greek noun ecclesia to carry the weight of all those cosmic truths. We already have words and concepts for the family of God and the kingdom of God.
Right.
Spiritual unity is a reality, but that reality does not retroactively rewrite the dictionary definition of a word that means a physical assembly. As the essay puts it, you don't need to jam every saved person into a universal ecclesia merely to account for their common salvation. The two truths stand side by side. Believers share a universal spiritual unity. And an ecclesia is a literal, functioning local assembly.
Okay, we've spent the first half of this deep dive in the abstract. We've debated Greek grammar, translation politics, and generic singulars, but the essay's title is Everything Proceeds from Doctrine. Ideas bleed into reality. It's time to look at the tangible consequences of this linguistic shift. How did redefining a single word physically alter human behavior over the centuries?
The essay transitions into a highly practical application to demonstrate this exact point, focusing on the historical transformation of the Lord's Supper.
This is where the ancient history becomes a mirror for our own modern habits, honestly. The text looks at the book of Acts. In Acts 2.42, 2.46, and Acts 20.7, the text repeatedly links gathering, doctrine, fellowship, and the breaking of bread. And it explicitly says they were eating meat with gladness. They were consuming real physical food together.
Yes. The author directs our attention to Paul's blistering instructions in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul repeatedly uses the phrases, when ye come together into one place, and when ye come together to eat. This was not a metaphorical gathering, and it certainly wasn't a sanitized token ritual.
No, it's messy.
Very. The text explicitly notes that during these early gatherings, the socioeconomic disparities of the real world were bleeding into the room. People were arriving hungry, other people were getting drunk on the wine, the wealthy were eating their fill, while the poor, likely slaves who had arrived late were being shamed because they had nothing.
I mean, you do not get drunk on a plastic thimble of grape juice, and you do not satisfy physical hunger with a tiny, paper-thin wafer. This was a chaotic, robust, real-world shared meal.
Exactly. The author highlights the stark, almost unrecognizable contrast between the apostolic practice and the modern practice. The original practice was a vital, shared meal. Physical unity, sharing resources, and taking care of the poor in the actual room were the central tenets of the event.
That was the whole point.
Yes. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10.1 quote, we being many are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. The shared physical loaf was the tangible manifestation of their unity. Today, centuries of tradition have reduced this vibrant, communal, deeply relational meal into an abbreviated, highly individualized ritual.
Let's trace the causality here, because this is the core of the essay's argument. How does the linguistic debate cause the meal to shrink? The author is arguing that because we changed our doctrine of what the church is, moving it from a literal, sharing physical community to a massive, invisible institutional structure, we inevitably changed how we interact within it.
That's the link.
If the church is primarily an invisible, mystical reality, then the physical meal doesn't actually matter. It doesn't need to sustain anyone. It simply becomes a solitary, symbolic token that you consume privately in your own head while sitting in a row next to complete strangers.
That is the exact synthesis. When the doctrine of the assembly becomes institutionalized and invisible, participation naturally devolves into spectatorship. The shared, communal table where people looked each other in the eye becomes a token portion distributed to a silent audience looking at a stage. The doctrine completely rewrote the practice.
A progression loop.
Yes. The alternative progression we discussed at the beginning, tradition, assumed meaning, interpretation, continued practice, has fully engulfed the event.
And the essay doesn't stop with the historical shift. It brings up a highly contemporary application that pushes this invisible church doctrine to its absolute technological limit. It looks at the phenomenon of virtual communion, taking communion online, alone in your living room, staring at a screen.
The essay applies its hermeneutical principles, its rules of interpretation, directly to this modern test case. It is a fascinating exercise in critical thinking. Now, the text acknowledges the obvious historical gaffe: the internet did not exist in the first century.
Right. Paul was not writing letters to the Corinthians about broadband latency or Zoom etiquette.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We cannot look for a verse that explicitly forbids digital technology. But the author asks us to look at the required mechanical elements that Paul did explicitly lay out in 1 Corinthians 11.
What are those requirements?
Paul requires the believers to come together in the church, to come into one place, to eat, and specifically he commands them to tarry or wait one for another.
The implication there is massive. Listen to the verbs. Come together, one place, tarry for one another. The author is saying this is the ultimate litmus test for your underlying doctrine.
Yes, it is.
If your definition of ecclesia allows for people to be completely physically isolated, sitting in their own homes, mediating their reality through a digital screen, then virtual communion makes perfect logical sense. It is the natural technological evolution of the invisible universal church doctrine.
Oh,
If ecclesia fundamentally, lexically means an actual physical gathering in one physical location where you share a literal loaf of bread to signify your physical unity and look each other in the eye while you wait for each other to eat, then virtual communion isn't just a fun, new technological convenience. It is an entirely fundamentally different doctrine.
And the essay asks us to grapple with the reality of that shift. Can you truly tarry one for another if you aren't even in the same building? Can you be one bread if geographically separated individuals are simultaneously consuming completely different pieces of food in their own separate environments?
You can't. You just can't.
This critique extends far beyond theology. It asks a profound question about human psychology and technology. It's the boiling frog syndrome applied to human interaction. When we move our core activities online, whether it's an ancient religious sacrament, a university seminar, or our workplace culture, do we preserve the actual essence of the activity, or does the technology fundamentally alter its nature without us even noticing?
We just accept the new practice because the technology makes it frictionless. We don't stop to ask if the underlying definition of what we are doing just got completely overwritten, realizing that your deeply held practices, the things you do every single week, might be completely misaligned with the founding texts you claim to follow. That is an incredibly jarring realization. It feels destabilizing. If someone reading this essay experiences that realization, how does the author suggest they handle it?
The source text concludes by looking at a passage from 2 Timothy 3.16, focusing on the idea that Scripture is profitable for reproof and for correction. And the essay digs into the original Greek noun used for correction here, which is epinorthosis.
Okay, let's break down epinorthosis. What does that mean?
It carries a very specific, almost medical sense in the ancient world. It refers to restoring something to an upright, correctly aligned state. The original sermon that this essay is based on uses the powerful illustration of setting a broken bone that has healed improperly.
Man, that is a visceral analogy. Think about a bone that breaks and isn't set right by a doctor. A misaligned bone still kind of works. You can still walk on a leg that healed slightly crooked, but it causes chronic friction.
Right, it hurts.
It limits your mobility, and over time, it slowly destroys the surrounding joints. To fix it, a surgeon has to go in, literally re-break the bone, and set it straight against a rigid splint. Setting it straight hurts intensely in the short term, but it is the absolute only way to heal properly and restore full, healthy function. The author is saying our inherited traditions are the misaligned bone.
It is a perfect parallel. The author is warning us that correction requires the painful work of restoring what has become misaligned over centuries. But they also add a crucial caveat to this process. Restoration is not innovation. You aren't inventing a new, trendy way to do things. You are humbly returning to the original blueprint.
You're just setting it straight.
The author points out a hard truth. Just because millions of people have practiced something for centuries doesn't automatically make it correct. Age does not make a tradition right, but antiquity doesn't make it wrong either. Age settles nothing. The only standard of measurement is the original text.
The essay emphasizes the attitude required for this process, too. It points to Galatians 6.1, which commands that restoration be done in the spirit of meekness.
Yes, the author stresses that this entire linguistic, historical, and theological exercise cannot be driven by arrogance or personal preference. It is not an excuse for someone to say, I just dislike authority, or I personally prefer meeting in small groups, or I'm tired of big buildings.
It's not about what you like.
Exactly. Personal preferences are irrelevant. It is strictly about textual alignment. The author is calling for a humble, sincere reevaluation of our inherited practices without condemning the sincerity or the faith of the millions of people who are currently practicing them.
Because, as the essay points out, most people have never had the opportunity to question this. They open an English Bible, they read the word church, and their brain naturally understands the word according to the modern environment they were raised in.
They're just doing what they know.
Right. They don't know about Tyndale's martyrdom. They don't know about King James's political translation mandates in 1604. They don't know the etymology of the Greek word kyriakon. They are acting in total sincerity based on the tools they were handed.
Exactly. Sincerity is not the issue being debated, but sincerity cannot determine doctrine. The appropriate response to uncovering this hidden linguistic history is not the condemnation of others, but a rigorous, humble examination of ourselves. The essay leaves the reader with a challenge. If these linguistic and historical conclusions are supported by the original texts, do we have the courage to reconsider the practices we've inherited?
We have covered massive ground today. We traced how a simple, everyday Greek word for a physical assembly ecclesia got systematically swapped out for a loaded institutional word church due to centuries of tradition and literal, politically motivated royal
It's
mandates.
a huge journey.
We saw how this linguistic displacement spawned the massive universal church theory by misunderstanding the generic use of singular nouns. And most importantly, we saw how that theoretical doctrine cascaded down to fundamentally transform highly relational physical communal practices like the Lord's Supper into highly individualized spectator driven rituals, a shift that eventually paved the way for the ultimate extreme of isolated screen based virtual communion.
And that entire historical arc brings us right back to the central thesis of the Dare to Think essay. Doctrine must ultimately become practice. As the author states, if our lives and our communities are not governed by the original doctrine, they will not exist in a neutral vacuum. They will automatically be governed by whatever tradition we have silently substituted for it.
It fills the void.
Yes, the call to action is to step outside the interpretation loop, to recognize the tradition-tinted glasses we are wearing, and to dare to examine our inherited habits against the original definitions.
Which leaves us with a truly lingering thought to chew on. This entire deep dive shows how changing the definition of one single core word altered 2,000 years of global human behavior. The cake tastes entirely different because someone in the past swapped the sugar for vanilla extract and we just kept baking it.
Just kept baking it.
It makes you wonder, what other ordinary words in our daily lives have we allowed to be silently redefined by the slow creep of tradition? In our legal systems, in our professional ethics, or in our cultural rule books, what other foundational definitions have been overwritten? And how are those invisible redefinitions secretly controlling the way you interact with the world right now?
It is a question that demands an answer.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.